Hello, everyone. My name is Gigi Gordon. I'm the Comms and Creative Manager at New Normal. I am joined by the fabulous Cheryl Morgan, our trans awareness trainer, to talk about trans rights for the Trans Day of Visibility.
Morning, Gigi, and hopefully everybody has got their clocks adjusted and whatever. It's a beautiful spring day here, so yay, roll on summer.
That was my attitude as well. It's a little bit cloudy today, but hopefully it picks up again.
Sure.
But just to kick off, what does trans visibility mean?
Well, I think the words trans and visibility are fairly obvious, but in this particular context, we should probably explain to our listeners, watchers, whatever, why we have a Trans Day of Visibility. Back in 1999, the first International Trans Day was founded, which was the Trans Day of Remembrance, and that takes place in November. And it is there specifically to memorialize trans people who have been killed in hate crimes. Now, that's a very specific and very somber job, but it was the only day that was available for quite a while. And well-meaning people kept using it as an excuse to celebrate trans lives, which really wasn't appropriate given the subject matter. So in 2009, an activist in Michigan decided that she wanted to have something that would be separate and much more positive and upbeat. So she founded the Trans Day of Visibility, and that person was Rachel Crandall. That was in 2009, and since then the Trans Day of Visibility has grown. It's become international. It's been officially endorsed by Joe Biden this year, and it is very much a day for celebrating trans lives as opposed to memorializing those that have been unfairly cut short. So that's why we have it.
Fantastic. And why do you think it's important?
Well, there's an old catchphrase to do with censuses, which says that if you're not counted, you don't count. If people don't know that your particular minority group exists, then you're not going to get any rights because nobody is actually aware that there's a problem. And back in the 20th century, when I transitioned, very few people knew that trans people existed. We had no civil rights at all. And it was very much a case that you had to hide your identity because there was no general public knowledge of what trans people were about. So you had to be very careful about it. Now, on the back of things like the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 and the Equality Act, a lot more people are now aware that trans people exist. And having some level of visibility means that we can actually put forward our case for the various political iniquities that we face and ask for something to be done about it. I think it's also useful that people actually understand how many trans people there are, because there tends to be an assumption, oh, there's only a handful of them somewhere or other, but in fact we make up almost 1% of the population, which is many thousands of people in the UK alone and millions of people worldwide.
Thank you for that brief history, Cheryl. And I just wanted to ask you, what are some of the dangers of visibility and why might trans people be afraid of being out? I think there's a whole host of reasons that I can certainly imagine, but it'd be great to hear from you exactly how that manifests.
Alrighty, well, to a certain extent, trans people can fly under the radar. That being trans is not like being a person of color. You don't wear your difference on your face. So from that point of view, the lack of visibility can be seen as a benefit. And again, back when I transitioned, we were told by the gender clinics that we should try to keep our identity a secret, because it was assumed back then that if anybody found out that we were trans, we would face such awful prejudice that our lives would effectively be over. Now, these days, of course, we have human rights, so there's a much better case for being visible, but visibility comes with its own dangers, as it were. And one of the interesting things I've noticed this year, there's a lovely organization called Total Jobs that do a lot of good work in the HR employment area, including they do every 5 years a survey of the state of employment issues for trans people. The first one was in 2016, and they did it again last year. And one of the highlights of that, that research was that back in 2016, 53% of trans people who responded to the survey said that they were not out to their colleagues at work. They felt that that was unsafe. Last year, that number had risen to 65%. Now that is a startling increase, and it shows you that trans people who do have jobs, and by the way, unemployment is rife amongst the trans community. Actually having a job is relatively unusual. But those trans people who do have jobs are scared of their colleagues finding out that they're trans. Now that's a very clear finding from that survey. And why are they scared? Well, there's a whole lot of prejudice which is suddenly happening against trans people, thanks to campaigns in the media and by politicians to demonize the trans community. And to a large extent, it's not affecting us. It's actually leading to a lot of violence against women. You can see that, for example, with all the fuss about trans people in toilets. And, you know, I've been using women's toilets for around 30 years now, and nobody has ever complained. But I have friends who are butch lesbians who say that they just don't use public toilets anymore because it's too dangerous. Because people assume that because they look relatively masculine in appearance, that they must be trans people and they should be kicked out of the toilet. I saw something on Twitter this morning where there's a whole load of kind ally people in jobs like healthcare who have badges with pronouns on. And a large number of cis women, I think this is mainly in America at the moment, but I'm sure it will spread. So cis women who have put their pronouns on their badges because they're in various service industry jobs are now being on the receiving end of transphobic abuse by their customers, clients, because the fact that you have a pronoun on your badge is assumed to be an indication that you are a trans person. And all of this is a result of this campaign of demonization that we're seeing in the media and through politicians. So it's no wonder that that trans people are frightened now. And you know, it all comes back to how equality law works. I think that in theory, trans people in the UK are protected by the Equality Act. So we have equality of provision of goods and services. But equality law doesn't work through the courts. You know, very few cases actually go through the courts, and most of those are ones that are required to set legal precedent because the existing law is unclear. Equality law works by people believing in it. If people believe that you should treat other people in society fairly, then they will. And if they don't, then they won't. And one of the effects of the Equality Act was to cause organisations all over the UK to start getting equalities training so that their staff could learn to be respectful to all of their clients and not discriminate in a racist way, in an ageist way, in an ableist way, and so on and so forth. And sadly, that protection is disappearing for trans people because of this idea that is being spread by the media and politicians that trans people, well, firstly, that the law doesn't say what it does say, and secondly, that trans people aren't deserving of equality or indeed even respect.
And I think that brings me back to a stat that we reference a lot at A New Normal, that 60% of LGB people who are out at university then go back in the closet once they start work. And I think it's really interesting that you raised the fact that supposedly trans people and LGBT people are meant to have more rights than ever before, but we're still seeing this backslide. So I'm sure you've seen the recent European report about how the UK is up there with some of the most hateful places in Europe as in its attitudes toward LGBT people. And I think that's something that we really like to differentiate between at a new normal, that inclusion is not the same thing as not excluding somebody. So for these trans people, for these LGBT people, they're not at work and seeing there's something that says you know you're not allowed to be LGBT here, that's illegal, because that is illegal. but they're not seeing something that says you should be included. We celebrate diversity here and we welcome you. And that's why diversity and inclusion training is so important. And I think, unfortunately, always will be. But just to move on to the next question, which is, how would you sum up the current state of trans rights in the UK? Now, I already have a bit of a bad feeling about this, but I think it's important that we discuss it.
Well, technically, of course, nothing has changed in that the government has not changed the law. But behind the scenes, a whole lot of things have changed. To start with, the government has put a whole bunch of new people in charge of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And those people appear to have been charged with a mission to change the meaning of the Equality Act with respect to trans people in order to remove the protections that we have. And you can see that, for example, in their intervention in the Scottish Gender Recognition Act, where there's a bill going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment to reform their Gender Recognition Act, and the EHRC intervened in that and complained. And the Scottish Parliament quite rightly said, what you're saying now is completely at odds with what you said in our previous discussions with you a year or so ago when you were under different management. So, there's something very disturbing going on there. And I've also referenced, of course, the campaigns in the media and through various politicians, including cabinet ministers, where people are making statements, writing articles, which suggest that trans people are, well, trans women in particular, are sexual predators, that trans men are deluded innocent victims, that all trans people are mentally ill, no one should ever need to transition, that trans people can be cured, and that conversion therapy for trans people is desirable. And all of this, feeds into public attitudes. And whilst it's still the case that the majority of British people do support trans rights, they're being subject to a barrage of misinformation. And how long that can hold out, I'm not really sure. I mean, we had a terrible situation just last week where Women's Aid, which is a major British charity that does work to protect women and girls from violence, from sexual assault and domestic abuse and so on, changed their policy on trans people, whereas previously they've been very trans inclusive. They've now put out a statement saying that it's entirely reasonable to exclude any trans woman from any charity operation to protect women and girls from violence.
And they're the people who probably need it the most. I mean,
yes, I mean, trans people are definitely subject to an awful lot of violence, much more so than committed. So yeah, so slowly but surely pressure is being put to bear on large organizations like Women's Aid to change their policy on trans inclusion. So even though the law hasn't changed, practically speaking, trans rights are being stripped away.
I'm also seeing a lot of transphobia sort of fester right now over sport. This is what I've been seeing up and up and up through all social media channels, news channels. And I think it's one of those things where the only thing I can compare it to that's my frame of reference is cultural appropriation, where it's something, that is like an easy entry point for people who don't really understand what's going on or really understand everything that's at play. So, for a lot of people who aren't, well versed in race relations, they'll enter at cultural appropriation, and then the discussion is completely takes up all of the air there when it's actually not something that's very important. And the same thing with trans women in sport, that they've got these studies saying that, biologically, after 2 years, trans women don't have any physical advantage in the sports. The only thing they have is, I believe it's 12%. They're 12% faster than the average woman. But of course, if you're competing at an Olympic level, you're going to be 12% faster than the average woman. And I think I'm seeing a lot of transphobia fester online from that perspective. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the subject.
I think the online is a clear problem. I mean, we have masses of evidence now that organizations like Twitter and Facebook are extremely lenient when it comes to people using anti-trans hate speech. but very, very quick to ban trans people from the platform if they get any complaints about them at all. And the anti-trans movement is very adept at organizing mass reporting campaigns against prominent trans people. So, I mean, you only have to say one thing that could be slightly interpreted as bad, and suddenly Twitter will be bombarded with thousands of complaints about your behavior, and you get banned. So the whole online thing is really not working very well. And frankly, I have no confidence whatsoever in the Minister for Culture, who doesn't seem to understand how software works. So, yeah. So yes, there's this, and the sport thing again is almost entirely based on misinformation. And you see what's happening in America, where not only are trans women being banned from participating in sport at all, but trans men are effectively being forced to compete against women, and they're going to win quite easily, which is ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing problem, and it's symptomatic really of the domination of right-wing narratives in the media all over the world. You have to hope that the fact that the narratives that these people are pushing are so similar to those that are being pushed by Mr. Putin, that perhaps people will start waking up and saying that these ideas are indeed deeply unsavory, and that our society is better off being fair and equal. But we're going through a pretty difficult time at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in light of that, I was wondering, what can anybody who's watching this video, what can they do to help a trans person that they might work with, or a trans person that they might know? Is there anything that people at home can do to help?
Well, I think just generally being, supportive and caring to a friend in need, because a lot of trans people are going through a really bad time at the moment. The impact on people's mental health of these constant attacks is pretty bad. So you need to be very tough to compete, to survive, whatever. But there are one or two, obvious practical things you can do. I think firstly, if you see somebody being abused in public, and it is safe to do so, then please do intervene, because in all probability the person being abused is not a trans person. It's simply somebody that was assumed to be a trans person, either because they looked a bit masculine or because they had a pronoun badge or something like that. The other thing is that the Scottish government, I mentioned earlier that they have a bill going through Scottish Parliament to reform their Gender Recognition Act. And that has been under sustained attack both by the Westminster government through the EHRC and by the right-wing media. And as a result of that, they have opened a third consultation. They've already had two consultations, both of which were firmly in support of the bill, but they've now decided to have a third consultation, presumably in the hope that that will give them an excuse to back down and not pass the bill. So I will give you, Gigi, a link to that. People have until the 16th of May to respond to it, and it has been very well hidden by the Scottish government, so a lot of people probably won't be able to find it without help. And you don't have to live in Scotland in order to respond to it. I mean, anybody in the UK can do so. So please do. It's a very simple thing. There's about half a dozen questions. Just respond to it in full in favour of the proposals in the bill, because you can guarantee that this thing is being shared all over Mumsnet, and they're getting thousands of responses from people who want that bill dropped.
And just to return to your first point, when you do see violence happening, for instance, if I saw it, I would want to help, but I'd be unsure exactly how to do it, because do I call the police and then they take too long to come? Do I try and intervene myself and potentially make the situation more violent or more damaging? How would you say would be the best way to approach it if you see something like that?
Well, I think if there's actual violence, it's probably not safe to get involved, other than perhaps if you can, like, film the thing, and then if it ever gets to court, you will have evidence. But you know, look to your own safety first. And obviously, if you're the sort of person that's liable to be attacked as well, then it's a good idea to steer well clear. But quite often these things will just be verbal abuse. And you know, if you see somebody being abused in a women's toilet, or if you see them being abused by, well, for example, has happened to me, by a barista in a coffee shop, then you know, you can go over and offer the victim sympathy. If that's somebody who desperately needs to go to the toilet, then you can perhaps offer to escort them so that they can get that done safely. But please, people, don't put yourselves at risk, because you know, the world is getting very very dangerous out there.
Thank you so much for all your insights today, Cheryl. And thank you to anybody watching. We hope you enjoyed this, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Yep. Alrighty. Thanks very much.
Thank you.